Welcome back, everybody, to Satisfactionist Live. I am your host, Ben Olmos, and we are here once again doing our thing, having a good time. And this week, we are joined by, sorry about that little music coming back in there. This week, we are joined by Karen Stollznow. And interesting story, and this is just kind of sometimes how things happen and how I kind of run. So I was reading psychology today online, and I came across this very interesting article that Karen had written around political correctness. And it was really intriguing. And so, out on a whim, I just wrote out and said, hey, I do this show. I would love to have you come on and talk about this topic because I think it's very interesting. So, without further ado, let me introduce you all to Karen. Karen, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I am doing wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for taking the time to join and have this conversation. Um,
Oh, very happy to be here. Thank you so much for reaching out to me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Karen, I know in the show kind of show notes, I do have a little bit on your background and what you do and some things that you've written. But
Mhm.
how about just for those folks just maybe tuning in, um, maybe a little bit about your background and
Sure.
what you do.
Yeah, well, you found my article on psychology today, but I'm not a psychologist. I'm actually a linguist. And I'm also an author and a podcaster, a fellow podcaster. I've got a show called Monster Talk, in which we look at the science behind monsters and cryptids and urban legends connected to various creatures. So I do lots of different interesting things and anything that takes my interest.
That I have to say, so that sounds really fun because my wife and my kids give me a hard time because I keep trying to tell them that Sasquatch is real, and and they don't believe me. But I'm telling you, I'm like, one of these days somebody's going to come up with proof. Of course, maybe you might debunk that because I also
Well,
read that you're a bit of a skeptic. So,
yeah, a bit of a skeptic. We definitely take a skeptical approach to claims of the paranormal, but Bigfoot certainly features very prominently on our show.
it's okay. You can continue to crush my dreams and tell me he's not real. Um,
Well, maybe that's for another show.
but let's go ahead and dive into this topic around political correctness. And one of
Sure.
the reasons that I kind of like to explore this topic is having come from a life in corporate America. There really is a lot of focus and attention on ensuring that your words are measured, that you're
Hmm.
operating in a workplace where you're not going out of your way to offend people, to upset people.
Right.
But it seems, at least for most of my kind of adulthood, that even though there's some positive intentions around the political correctness as a term,
Hmm.
there's also a lot of kind of this negativity that comes about from it. And one of the things that you wrote that I thought was very interesting in your article was that the word political correctness is kind of has some positive aspects to it, but the definitions that come from it are typically created by people who are not part of that group that we are trying to not offend.
Hmm. Oh, well, I think that there is a really broad range of terms that can be considered to be politically correct. I think that some terms are really just an evolution of language, where we might refer to a waitress formerly now as a server, or to refer to a manhole cover as a utility cover, or a person hole cover if you want to be a bit silly about things or funny about things. So, and then there are certainly some terms which have come up historically, which have not been created by stakeholders. Usually, people who belong to various different groups will come up with terms that they want to use to describe themselves. But some politically correct terms which have come into being over the past few decades haven't been created by stakeholders, have been kind of imposed on people instead. And so, as I mentioned in the article, that typically is the case when it comes to ableist terminology or terms describing people with disabilities. So back in the 60s and 70s, we had some terms which are now deemed to be offensive. So I don't know if you want me to use them or if you'd rather me refrain
We're
from using these terms.
we're not censored here, but I mean, we're using it in the context of education,
Right,
not because we're trying to offend. So let's
sure.
just we'll proceed with that understanding.
Sure. So historically, some terms for people with disabilities included mental retardation, and so to basically to use terms which are more polite or considered to be more polite and have more positive connotations, terms arose like special and it's a very interesting thing because what tends to happen with a lot of areas of language that could be considered to be embarrassing or sensitive in some way can fall prey to something called the euphemism treadmill. And I think that term was originally used by Steven Pinker, a psychologist. So what it refers to is language that is embarrassing, and we try to introduce new terms so that they're more polite or they're less embarrassing, but those terms still take on those same negative connotations, and then new terms are introduced, and so you have this kind of cycle, this vicious cycle. So a good example I like to give is a word like words related to the word toilet. So historically we might have called a toilet a lavatory or a privy or a latrine. And so those terms became offensive. And so then you had other words which were brought in to replace those. So like toilet, and then more recently, bathroom, and now restroom, especially in the United States. And so what we're trying to do is be more euphemistic, be less offensive, but these terms just have this inherent offensiveness for some people. And that's why it doesn't matter what term we use, those terms are going to become offensive. So going back to the language of talking about disability, there were some terms which came into usage back in the 1980s in an effort to be more polite and more respectful. And these were terms like challenged and even handicapable. And so a lot of people thought, oh, these terms are a bit ridiculous. And certainly people whom these terms referred thought, well, this doesn't reflect me. I don't want to use this term. They didn't embrace these terms, and they were ultimately rejected. So now people will talk about disabilities, physical disabilities, or intellectual disabilities, rather than using terms that have been imposed on them. And often these terms are well-intentioned, and people just want to be polite. They don't want to be offensive. But certainly, if the terms don't come from stakeholders, they're not going to be embraced and used ultimately.
Yeah, I think that is a little bit of the challenge too, because it's kind of trying to find that uniformity in a term where
Hmm.
it is something that is developed. And one of the things that we always talk about in corporate America is allowing folks to have a voice in, have a say in the process, if you will. And so
Absolutely.
how do you create a term that is most acceptable, without including those folks who for whom you're referring, right? So, um,
Yeah.
are there?
I think it's
Go ahead,
I
please.
think it's a matter of listening to these communities. Some people will say, "Oh, it's politically correct to use a term like vision impaired for blind," and but in some cases, people want to use that term. Certainly, when it comes to the blind community or the deaf community, they prefer to use these terms which are more overt than to, I guess, kind of pussyfoot around and use something that might not be seen to be as explicit. But again, it's just really a matter of talking to people and finding out what term they want to use, and what terms reflect their experiences and their issues and concerns and challenges. So it's not really too difficult. I think a lot of people will complain, oh, you can't say anything anymore, or everything's offensive. You can't keep up with what's offensive, but we can and we do, and these things are constantly changing.
Yeah, that is true, and one of the things that I think is challenging, and I talk about this a lot, especially in the workplace, because we're living in a time now where we have such a generational span in the workplace,
Mhm.
and what was acceptable language for one generation is entirely different for another. And how how do you get folks to kind of understand that without immediately ringing the I'm offended alarm bell,
Yeah.
and trying to get somebody in trouble because of something they said, when it's just we're not giving people, I think, that opportunity to get up to speed.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's a matter of listening to people and, but these terms are absolutely always evolving. And I think we need to look at context too. So if someone said something that was offensive 50 years ago, to look at that within its context and how was that viewed in the day? Was that offensive in the day? Was that acceptable? But yeah, I don't think we should jump down people's throats if they don't use the correct term. But I think the important thing is to be open minded and to be self aware as well. And again, to listen and talk to people and find out what terms are current and preferred and accepted. Um, and just try to keep up with things. But it is absolutely possible. There are a lot of handbooks and guides. If I might introduce my own book at this
Sure.
point, I've
Yeah.
just released this book. So on the offensive, prejudice in language past and present. And so I really do look at a lot of language in various areas that can be considered to be racist or sexist or ableist or ageist, and to look at words historically, but also in a contemporary context, to understand why terms can be offensive, because often offensive terms have a lot of historical baggage, and you'll find some people who will say, "Oh, that word's not offensive," but it certainly can be to stakeholders because of their experiences and because of the history of a term.
Yeah, I think too that is certainly part of the challenge. I think about my parents, for example, who are kind of at an age of I don't they've never outwardly expressed this or anything, but I do wonder if sometimes they're like, look, I am who I am. Like, I'm not gonna change. At this point, I'm just focused on living my best years. And whereas somebody younger who is really trying to be current, might be a little bit more on top of getting up to speed with things. Um,
Oh yeah, and I think there can certainly be some people who revel in being politically incorrect
yeah,
and being sexist and being racist and saying, "Well, this is who I am," and I'm a strong person. I'm up front, and take it or leave it, and who kind of have that cavalier attitude. But again, I think it really depends on the context. I think it sounds like in the case of your parents, they're not wanting to offend anyone. They're not wanting
yeah,
to be
yeah,
rude. Whereas with some people, they're deliberately setting out to be offensive. But I really do make a point in my book of saying that everyone has an Achilles heel. I mean, you certainly have oppressed groups and you have stigmatized groups, but everyone has some kind of Achilles heel, something that they would find offensive, whether it's ageist remarks or whether it's remarks about gender or sexuality. There's something that hits home with all of us, and we want other people to be respectful towards us, and therefore we should really be giving respect to other people as well.
And I think I honestly that's probably the best advice, is kind of the golden rule approach, is treat others as if how you would want to be treated. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a bottom line.
yeah, very much so. So in the research that you've done around this, and I know you've kind of explored origins of words and kind of brought it through history, as you kind of explained in your book. Was there anything surprising in the research that you did that maybe you didn't expect?
Oh, uh, I look at hundreds, if not thousands, of words in the book, and I hate to blow my own trumpet, but I would say that on every page there is something interesting about a word, some kind of background or origins or history of which I wasn't aware, that I really found to be shocking and interesting. And I guess if we're on the topic of talking about disability, uh, a lot of people might use as an insult or a slur a word like moron, and to actually find that that was in my research, that that was a term that goes back about 100 years, and it was used as a former clinical classification for people, like terms like idiot. So moron was introduced to replace feeble or feeble-minded, which is a kind of old-fashioned term. So this was really a classification which is no longer in use, and it's also, it has very, very negative history in that it is associated with uh, immigrants coming into the United States, or being denied entry into the country, or being forced to undergo sterilization because of the classification of them as being morons. So we might use that term, or we might use other terms like mad or crazy or stupid, and think, oh, these are just everyday terms and I don't mean anything behind it. I'm not talking about people, I'm talking about concepts or policies as being stupid or crazy. But usually there is a person that is behind the concept or the policy or the idea. And that's why those terms can be offensive, but they do have a very long history of abuse in the way that they were used to classify people and abuse people.
Right, right. Well, and I think that's probably one of the more interesting things about this is that kind of how that language evolves, how what
Hmm.
is a seemingly acceptable term in one era, as generations advance and you move on and um, you discover new things, new words, new terminologies, and then at some point we decide that is now an ugly word. And I think that's probably
Hmm.
one of the big challenges is it's not like there's a bulletin that goes out that says, attention everybody, this is no longer an acceptable word. We just kind of
That's
evolve
right.
into it. And so,
Oh yeah, you can certainly stumble across or use a word and then find out that it is offensive. And I mean, I've done that myself too. I absolutely, no one is perfect. And again, I think it's about listening to other people and their experiences. And we can't really say, oh, something's not offensive if we don't have the background and the experiences that they have had. But yeah, it is common for words to, we call it pejoration or to pejorate in linguistics, where a word becomes a pejorative. So a word that might be formally innocuous can just develop negative connotations, and there are lots of reasons why this can happen. But it's very uncommon for words to ameliorate or become better. But you certainly get some groups of people who are really good at reclaiming terms, taking words back. For example, a word like gay. I mean, historically, going back hundreds of years ago, that was a positive term. It meant happy. It's actually my mother's name. And then you had a lot of negativity going back about 100 years ago, and the negative associations with that term and it being used as an insult by outsiders, by other people. And then to have that word be reclaimed, and now to really be the most common term that's used, especially by men, by gay men. And it's just become a positive term after many decades of being a negative word. So yeah, words can do all kinds of things. They can become negative, they can become positive, they can, their meanings can narrow or they can broaden. Language is a runaway train.
yeah, I will say, the field of linguistics is very interesting to me, and I think it's very interesting to just kind of hear how words and terms and not only just word origin, because word origin is one of those things that always just kind of fascinates me, but how things evolve. And
Hmm.
I don't know if you can get the word out to the linguist community, but there is one word that just annoys the heck out of me that is being way overused these days, which is the word
Hmm.
super.
Yeah,
Everything is super something, and
yeah, yeah.
I'm personally, for me, I'm kind of over it. But
Well, yeah, I think everyone has their pet peeves, words that they like, they use every day, and then other words that annoy them for one reason or another. So it's a very personal thing. Yeah, I've always said we all speak language, and therefore we feel like we're experts. We're certainly experts on our own language and the way that we speak as individuals. But we can, I think, we all think we know a lot about language, whether we do or we don't. But there's certainly a lot of folkloric beliefs that people have about language, which are not necessarily correct. I think we have a lot of biases when it comes to language.
well, something that I've actually was reading recently, and I have to say, I mean, for me, it's a little hard to digest because I'm a little bit of a traditionalist, and so the article was about you know different different dialects, different ways of speaking,
Hmm.
and whether or not we have determined. So, for example, using da instead of the,
Hmm.
that they're not breaking any rules per se. That
Hmm.
language is not set in stone. It used to
Oh,
be when I
right.
was growing up in school that you didn't end a sentence in a preposition, and now that
Yeah.
doesn't seem to be any
Well,
big
yeah.
rule breaker anymore.
Oh, well, a lot of those rules were created a couple of hundred years ago and appear in books of grammar. And some of them were actually created by the clergy in Britain. So really, they're just a lot of them are associated with uh, maybe upper classes, so that there's a kind of classist aspect to them, and they might be associated with going to expensive schools and having the money to have a really good education. But the fact is that when it comes to language, I mean, you've got standard ways of talking, standard varieties of a language. So I tend to refer to a standard of a language as perhaps being the language that you'll hear if you're watching the news, and someone will be talking in a very formal way. And non-standard ways of talking will be more uh, just dialects which are used by other groups of people. So a good example would be what people know as Ebonics or African American Vernacular English. And so, I mean, there's been a lot of research that's been done into non-standard varieties of English in particular. And the consensus is among linguists that these are not incorrect ways of speaking, and there is no necessarily correct or pure or better or bad or good way of speaking. There are just different ways of speaking. And non-standard varieties of a language still are rule driven. So they follow particular rules of grammar. They're just not the more formal style that we might be familiar with and might associate with money or education. So again, I think our biases and prejudices are coming into play when we hear an accent that might be different to ours. I mean, as an Australian, dealing with people on a day-to-day basis, have a lot of people say to me, "Oh, you've got an accent. What's that accent?" Or "I don't have an accent." So I think there's an assumption that we have that we are accentless, and that it's other people who have accents, but that's not the case. We've all got an accent.
Yeah, there is always there is something there. You're going to encounter somebody who doesn't speak like you at some point, and you will be the person with the accent.
Absolutely. It's a relative thing.
um, so just real quick, and just one of these questions, kind of out of curiosity. So I know that you've also you teach, you taught, you do teach. Um, And so I wonder, when you're teaching in the field of linguistics,
Mhm.
um, Do you use any sort of standards for papers being turned in? Like we use APA quite a bit because that's
Yeah.
commonplace in the business world.
Hmm.
But y- if we have this understanding that the rules of language are flexible, does that
Hmm.
apply to papers being written?
That is such a good question. Linguistics is about describing language, so it's not about prescribing language. So here we are talking about these rules and grammatical rules, not ending a sentence with a preposition and things like that. And yet, I think that there is a kind of hypocrisy is probably not the right word, but there is a even though we teach that you can write in informal ways and you can speak in informal ways, and there are different dialects and there are different standard or non-standard ways of speaking. Certainly when it comes to papers, there is an expectation that students are going to write in a more formal way. They're going to use punctuation. They're going to write in a way which is just more formal. But there are a lot of semantic elements to these kinds of things too. With punctuation, if you use incorrect punctuation, then that changes the meaning of what you're saying. So it's this when it does come to assessment, yeah, there is that kind of, I guess, double standard that we have an expectation that the assignments are going to be submitted and be formal in the way that the student writes. So yeah, there is that kind of give and take there.
It's just it's a very interesting paradigm when you consider the
Yeah.
fact that you want to argue I certainly don't I as I mentioned, it's difficult to digest because I think to myself, well, yes, but at the same time, is and again, I'm kind of speaking from my own school of teaching, which is in the business world.
Mhm.
um, you want to try and ensure that you're putting that best foot forward in your communication style and structuring words and sentences correctly.
Well, yeah. And I think it's also just about being exposed to that prescriptivism and that descriptivism too, and being able to differentiate and to think, well, I'm learning this, and this is about linguistics is about observation, not about telling people how to write or how to speak. But then there's this more formal side of education and these standards that I need to subscribe to. So yeah, it's a paradox.
Yeah, most certainly. It's one of the things I was actually teaching a class earlier this week, and one of the things we were talking about diversity in the workplace, and it is certainly a very important thing. We need to have diversity of across many different bounds, not just kind of the protected classes.
Right.
But one of the things I always challenge people with is, um, you know, if you're going to be accepting of diversity, you also have to be accepting of those people who refuse to accept diversity. and and I'm not saying that that's the best career choice, and I'm not saying that you should live your life that way, because there are
Hmm.
consequences to that. However,
Hmm.
we can't if you were going to force people into having to accept it, then you're going against everything that you believe in. So,
Oh, yeah, it's absolutely about tolerance. And I think really about educating people and giving them the tools and saying, when you use particular words, here is how they're going to be received. And this is what these words mean. And here's this history and this background. Now do with this what you will. But certainly it's, it's a difficult thing to juggle.
it is most definitely. Well, Karen, I absolutely appreciate your time and coming on and sharing some wisdom and insights as it relates to this topic. It's one that it's going to continue to evolve. It is something that is not set in stone, and I
Mhm.
can certainly understand the frustration that people can have when you don't feel like you're saying the right thing.
Oh, yeah, it could be very confusing and puzzling, and especially if you're used to having spoken a certain way your whole life.
Yeah, I mean, your upbringing, your culture, your background kind of infuses you with a lot of perceptions about what words are acceptable and not acceptable. And
Absolutely.
it's one of those things that I always encourage people to just have some patience around it, and not kind of rush to conclusions that everybody's got the same dictionary that you do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And again, thinking about political correctness, it has developed a lot of negative connotations over time, but I do think that there are positive intentions behind it.
Before we break, just want to take a moment real quick. You had shared with us your latest writing. What are some other places where they can find out a little bit more about you or other things that you've written?
Sure. So you could visit my website, which is karenstollznow.com, and also my podcast, Monster Talk, which is a show I do with my co-host Blake Smith. And if you can go to Amazon and check out a number of books that I've published, and I write short stories as well. So yeah, I've got a couple of sites out there that people can visit, and I do lots of different interesting things.
Awesome. Well, that is, from a guy who also does a lot of different things, from working in the wine
Well, things that
industry
interest
to
me anyway.
yeah, I mean, it's I think there are folks who kind of wonder. I know I get to ask this question a lot, like, what do you do? And usually when I meet somebody, it's like, so what do you do? And I'm like, it's a long answer. So let's just say I work in the wine industry and
At a
call it that.
party or something. Yeah. Well, this year it's been a bit easier to dodge that kind of question.
Most definitely. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining
Thank
us
you,
today.
Ben.
And folks, if you are interested in checking out more of Karen's work, please check out her website. In the meantime, we are continuing to put together some wonderful shows in the future. We're going to be a little bit off our beat a little during the holidays, as you all could imagine, but we are working towards the new year and have some things lined up. So I hope that you will join us back again. And until then, everybody, have a good one, and we'll see you later.